Power, wealth, success. Tyrell Jackson had it all, but none of it mattered the day he stepped into his own store as just another customer. What should have been a simple shopping experience turned into something far more disturbing. The side glances, the cold shoulders, the silent judgment. Employees who once thrived under his leadership now treated him like he didn't belong. That day, Tyrell didn't just see bias, he felt it. Would his own employees dare to judge him? Would they treat him like an outsider in a place he built? And if they did, what would he do about it? Hit subscribe and stay with us. This story is only getting started, and you won't want to miss a second of it. Tyrell Jackson had built an empire from the ground up. As a black entrepreneur, he had faced obstacles, doubts, and outright discrimination, but none of it had stopped him. Over the years, he had transformed his vision into reality, a nationwide chain of high-end retail stores known for luxury, exclusivity, and impeccable customer service. His brand represented elegance, quality, and prestige, and it had earned him both wealth and respect. But lately, troubling reports had reached him. Customers, especially black shoppers, had complained of unfair treatment at one of his top-performing stores. Some said they were ignored by sales staff, while others felt watched as if they were criminals instead of paying customers. A few had even been asked unnecessary questions about their ability to afford the expensive merchandise. The accusations disturbed Tyrell deeply. He had built his business on the belief that everyone deserved an exceptional shopping experience regardless of background. At first, he considered handling the issue the usual way, sending investigators, conducting an internal review, or calling for a staff meeting. But Tyrell knew better. Employees always behaved differently when they knew the boss was watching. If racism was lurking inside his own store, he needed to see it for himself. He needed the unfiltered truth. And so, he made a decision. Instead of walking in as Tyrell Jackson, CEO, he would enter as an average customer, an unknown black man with no visible signs of wealth. He wanted to experience firsthand what his black customers might be facing. To do that, he had to strip away his status. Standing before his mirror, he made the transformation. Gone were the tailored suits, the designer watches, and the polished shoes that marked him as a man of wealth. Instead, he dressed in a pair of worn jeans, a simple sweater, and scuffed sneakers. He tucked away his platinum credit cards and chose a standard debit card instead. No driver, no assistant, just himself. For the first time in years, he blended into the background. As he approached the store, he hesitated for a brief moment. He had spent years perfecting the customer experience, ensuring every store reflected his values. Yet, if the complaints were true, then something had gone terribly wrong. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the glass doors and stepped inside. Today, Tyrell Jackson wasn't the owner. He was just another black man walking into a luxury store. The store stood tall in one of the wealthiest, predominantly white neighborhoods in the city. Its sleek glass exterior and perfectly arranged window displays reflected the luxury it promised. High-end fashion, designer accessories, and an elite shopping experience. Business was thriving here, just as Tyrell had intended when he first expanded to this location. As he stepped inside, the cool air carried the scent of expensive perfume, and the soft melody of instrumental music played overhead. The lighting was warm, highlighting the carefully curated merchandise, and employees moved about the store with polished ease. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. But Tyrell had built his career on noticing the details others ignored. He took a slow look around. A middle-aged white couple entered right behind him. Instantly, a sales associate excused herself from her conversation and greeted them with a bright, welcoming smile. "Good afternoon. How can I assist you today?" she asked, her voice dripping with warmth. Tyrell, standing just a few feet away, received no such greeting. A young white man in a tailored suit strolled in. Within seconds, another associate broke away from adjusting a display and approached him. "Looking for something in particular?" The excitement in her voice was unmistakable. Meanwhile, at the perfume counter, a black woman stood patiently. She adjusted her purse strap and cleared her throat, trying to get someone's attention. An employee walked right past her without acknowledgement, too busy laughing at something a coworker had said. Then Tyrell noticed something else. A young Latino man picked up a leather wallet from a display. Almost instantly, a nearby employee's eyes locked onto him. She didn't approach him with an offer to help. Instead, she subtly repositioned herself, watching. The pattern was undeniable. White customers were met with smiles, assistance, and enthusiasm. Black and brown customers were either ignored or, worse, subtly monitored. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was clear who was truly welcomed here. Tyrell clenched his jaw. He had spent years crafting a brand built on luxury, not exclusion. And yet, here, inside one of his most profitable stores, an invisible line had been drawn. If this was how the system worked, it was time to push against it. Tyrell moved toward the high-end jewelry section, his eyes scanning the gleaming display of luxury watches. Behind the glass, the finest timepieces rested on velvet cushions, sleek, sophisticated, and wildly expensive. Each one was a statement of power, success, and prestige. He stopped in front of a particular model, an exquisite Swiss-made watch with a platinum case and diamond-encrusted bezel. The craftsmanship was flawless, the kind of accessory that commanded attention without saying a word. A sales associate noticed him. The man, a tall, clean-cut employee with a neatly pressed uniform, stepped forward. His name tag read Jason. But instead of greeting Tyrell with enthusiasm, his gaze flickered downward, taking in the casual sweater, the worn sneakers. His polite mask stayed in place, but his eyes betrayed something else. Doubt. "That's expensive, sir," Jason said, his tone measured as if offering a warning rather than assistance. Tyrell met his gaze, unfazed. He had seen this look before, the quiet assumption that a black man dressed like him couldn't possibly afford what was in the case. "I figured," Tyrell said smoothly. "I was wondering about financing options." Jason's eyebrows lifted slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before he masked it with a tight smile. "We don't usually do payment plans for these," he said, his voice carrying a hint of finality. Tyrell said nothing, just nodded. The message was clear. This watch isn't for you. He might have left it at that. But what happened next made his jaw tighten. A white man in a tailored navy blue suit walked up to the same display, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor. He was mid-30s, well-groomed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being catered to. Jason's posture changed instantly. His entire demeanor shifted from guarded to welcoming in a heartbeat. "Good afternoon, sir," he said with enthusiasm. "That's an excellent choice. This model features a handcrafted movement with a sapphire crystal case back. We also offer flexible payment plans if needed." Tyrell didn't move. "We don't usually do payment plans for these." Just seconds ago, those were Jason's exact words. But now the rules had changed. Without hesitation, he was laying out options, eager to assist. The double standard couldn't have been clearer. Tyrell exhaled slowly. He had expected discrimination, but witnessing it unfold so plainly still sent a familiar frustration through him. Yet, he didn't let it show. He had work to do, and this was only the beginning. Without a word, he turned and walked away, undeterred. Tyrell wandered through the clothing section, his eyes scanning the racks of premium jackets, designer shirts, and tailored pants. Each piece was an investment, a statement of style and success. He slid his hand over the fabric of a sleek black designer jacket, a piece that exuded sophistication. The price tag didn't deter him, he had the means. He picked it up, draped it over his arm, and made his way toward the fitting rooms. As he approached the entrance, a white female associate, Kelly, according to her name tag, stepped in front of him. Her smile was polite but not warm, and her posture was rigid. "Sir," she said in a firm tone, "we have to hold your card first before letting you try that on." Tyrell paused, looking at her. He raised an eyebrow, a calm but puzzled expression on his face. "Excuse me?" he replied, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Kelly didn't hesitate. "For certain high-value items, we have to hold your card as a policy," she explained, her voice flat, giving the impression that she had done this 1,000 times before. Tyrell didn't respond immediately. He took a breath, considering his options, but his gaze didn't waver from her, and he slowly turned his attention to the fitting room door. At that moment, a young white man walked past them, arms full of clothing, several jackets, shirts, and accessories. He approached the fitting room with ease, not even glancing at Kelly. Without a word, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. No hesitation, no request for his card. Tyrell watched the scene unfold. His jaw tightened as the contrast couldn't have been clearer. He turned back to Kelly, his voice now calm but firm. "Why is he treated differently?" Kelly shrugged dismissively, a motion that didn't go unnoticed. "It's just store policy," she said, as if the matter was settled, as if that was the end of the conversation. But Tyrell could feel the injustice rising within him. It wasn't a policy, it was a subtle form of discrimination. He had spent his life working hard, achieving success, and yet here he was, facing an unnecessary barrier based purely on the color of his skin, the quiet discomfort, the lack of acknowledgement, and the cold assumption that he couldn't afford the jacket. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one he had seen many times before. Tyrell remained calm, his face impassive, but inside, he knew. He had seen this kind of behavior before when the system, no matter how polished it appeared on the surface, was designed to keep people like him in their place. "Thank you, but I'll pass," he said quietly, handing the jacket back to her. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps resolute. Still composed, Tyrell walked toward the customer service desk, his mind sharp and focused. He had seen enough to know the pattern, but he needed confirmation, something tangible to hold on to. As he approached the desk, he took a deep breath, steadying himself for what he knew could be another test of patience. Behind the counter sat a white man, Greg, his name tag read. Greg was in his late 40s, his posture stiff, and his demeanor cold. When Tyrell approached, Greg barely looked up from the computer screen in front of him. There was a momentary pause, a flicker of discomfort in Greg's eyes, but nothing more. He didn't greet Tyrell, he simply waited for him to speak. "I was hoping to ask about the store policies," Tyrell began, keeping his tone calm and even. "Can you clarify what the rules are for trying on high-value items?" Greg's response was a one-word mutter, barely audible, "Same." Tyrell resisted the urge to frown. He could feel the tension in the air, the subtle dismissal, but he didn't let it show. He pressed on, asking politely, "I'd like to speak to the manager about this situation." Greg's eyes flickered toward Tyrell for a brief second before he sighed audibly, the sound almost exaggerated. "The manager's busy," he muttered, clearly uninterested in providing further assistance. Tyrell's hand tightened around the strap of his bag, but he kept his voice steady. When would be a good time to speak with him? Greg didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused back on his screen, tapping away at the keyboard with a mechanical rhythm, his disinterest clear. Just as Tyrell was about to ask again, a white woman approached the counter behind him. She had a bright, friendly smile, her arms full of shopping bags. The moment Greg saw her, his demeanor completely changed. "Hello, how can I help you today?" he asked enthusiastically, his voice warm and inviting. He even got up from his chair to assist her, offering a wide smile. Tyrell felt his jaw tighten. There it was again, the stark contrast in treatment. The white woman had barely arrived, and Greg was already eager to help her, while Tyrell, after patiently waiting, had been brushed aside with barely any attention. Tyrell took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had seen the bias, felt it, but witnessing it so clearly right in front of him was different. He stood still for a moment, watching as Greg helped the woman with enthusiasm, the conversation flowing easily. Tyrell clenched his jaw, now fully aware of the extent of the problem. This wasn't about store policies. It was about something deeper, something systemic. And it was clear he wasn't going to get any answers here. Tyrell stood near the entrance of the store, his mind racing as he processed the events that had unfolded. The discriminatory treatment had been blatant, undeniable, but there was still a sense of quiet disbelief in him. He had seen bias before, but this was different. The clear, consistent pattern of behavior was unsettling, and he could feel the weight of it pressing on him. As he turned to leave, a quiet voice broke through the murmur of the store's background noise. "Sir," the voice said, low and careful. Tyrell turned slightly, finding a black woman standing just a few feet away from him. She looked around quickly, as though making sure no one else could see her, before taking a small step closer. "I saw what happened," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously as though speaking up could get her into trouble. "I just want you to know you're not imagining it. It happens all the time." Tyrell's gaze softened. He had been prepared for this kind of behavior from the customers, but hearing it confirmed from someone who worked there, the very place where the discrimination had occurred, added another layer of gravity to the situation. The woman's face was calm, but there was an undeniable sadness in her eyes. "I work here, and I've seen it with my own eyes," she continued in a hushed tone. "Customers complain all the time, but nothing ever changes. They say the same things you're experiencing. They notice it, but the higher-ups, they don't care." Tyrell nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It was confirmation, but it also fueled something deeper within him, a growing resolve. He had known that racism was pervasive, but to hear it from someone who had witnessed it day in and day out solidified everything. He glanced at Lisa, her eyes filled with empathy, but also a weary understanding. He could sense the frustration in her, the helplessness that came from working in an environment where nothing ever seemed to improve. "Thank you," Tyrell said quietly, his voice calm but determined. "I appreciate you speaking up." Lisa gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, stepping back into the shadows of the store as quickly as she had appeared. As Tyrell watched her retreat, his resolve hardened. This store, and everything it represented, was about to get a wake-up call. He wasn't going to walk away quietly, and he wasn't going to let this slide. Not anymore. In that moment, he made a promise to himself. He would fight this. He would make them listen. Tyrell's patience was at its breaking point. The last few interactions had been the final straw, and the thin veneer of politeness he had maintained was now slipping away. He stood at the counter, his hands steady but his mind seething. The indifference, the dismissive attitudes, it had all added up. It was time to confront it head on. "I want to speak to the manager," Tyrell said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the hum of the store. Greg, the employee at the counter, didn't even look up from his screen. "The manager's busy," he muttered, as if repeating a well-rehearsed line. "I'm not asking," Tyrell replied, his words colder now. "I'm telling you, get John." Greg looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at Tyrell before muttering something under his breath and walking away. A few moments later, John, the store manager, appeared. He walked toward the counter with an air of indifference, his gaze barely lifting to meet Tyrell's. His face was impassive, and there was no trace of warmth or concern in his expression. "Sir, if you have a complaint," John said dismissively, "you can call corporate. We're very busy here." Tyrell felt a sharp pang of frustration. The condescending tone, the complete lack of effort to even acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. It was clear this was how things had always been handled. But Tyrell wasn't going to let it slide. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, professional-looking business card. He placed it gently on the counter, the sound of it hitting the polished surface echoing in the quiet of the store. "I own this company," he said, his voice low but firm. Silence. For a long moment, the room froze. The employees who had been working the background immediately stopped what they were doing. Their eyes darted between Tyrell and John, sensing the shift in the air. The tension was palpable. John's face drained of color. He stammered, his composure completely unraveling. "Mr. Jackson, I didn't know." Tyrell didn't let him finish. He cut him off with a quiet but forceful command. "You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." His words were clear, unyielding. There was no room for debate. John opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He fumbled for words, trying to grasp at some excuse, some justification for the behavior Tyrell had just witnessed. But nothing he could say would take away the sting of the moment. "Your employees have treated me and others with disdain," Tyrell continued, his voice cold and unrelenting. "And you let it happen. You've been too busy to care about what's happening right under your nose." John's eyes flicked nervously around the room, clearly struggling to recover from the shock. His hands, which had been casually resting at his sides, now twitched slightly, unsure of what to do. I apologize, Mr. Jackson. I didn't realize." Tyrell raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's the problem," he said, his voice calm but stern. "You didn't realize. And that's exactly why things like this keep happening, because you don't pay attention until it's too late." The employees around the store were now watching, some with curiosity, others with a sense of unease. Tyrell's presence was commanding, and it was clear that something significant had just shifted in the atmosphere. John cleared his throat, his hands now visibly shaking. "We'll do better, Mr. Jackson. I'll speak to everyone." Tyrell didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, his eyes steady on John, letting the silence fill the room for a few moments longer. Finally, he spoke, his tone resolute. "I expect action, not words, and I'll be watching closely. This store isn't the exception, it's the rule. Change starts now." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. The store had been tense ever since Tyrell's confrontation with John. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of his words, and he could feel the eyes of the employees still lingering on him as he stood near the entrance. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Tyrell turned to John, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Gather everyone," he said simply, "now." John, still visibly rattled by the earlier exchange, didn't hesitate this time. He quickly moved to the back office and came back with a few hurried instructions, calling the employees to the front of the store. Within minutes, the entire team had assembled. Jason, Kelly, Greg, and the others, standing in a semicircle, their faces tense, some still not quite able to look Tyrell in the eye. Tyrell stood at the front, facing them all, his posture commanding but his expression calm. He wasn't here to entertain excuses or apologies. "You've seen me here today," Tyrell began, his voice steady and firm, carrying across the quiet room. "And I've seen everything I need to see. This store, this environment is broken, and it's your responsibility to fix it. All of you. Starting now." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I will not tolerate racial bias in any form. Not from the customers, not from the employees, and especially not from the leadership. What I've witnessed here today, what you've allowed to happen, is unacceptable, and it stops now." A few of the employees shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering nervously between Tyrell and each other. They could feel the weight of his gaze, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. From this moment forward, Tyrell continued, his tone unwavering, we are implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff. This will be non-negotiable. Every one of you will undergo training to understand the impact of your actions and words. We're going to fix this, and we're going to start with you. The room was silent. Some employees nodded, others shifted their weight uncomfortably, but none spoke. Tyrell turned his attention to Jason and Kelly, who were standing at the back of the group, looking anywhere but at him. You two, Tyrell said, his voice cold, are suspended pending an investigation, effective immediately. Your actions today were not just inappropriate, they were harmful. I'll be looking into this further, and if I find that you've been violating this company's values, you'll be held accountable. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kelly, standing beside him, looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment. Neither one dared to challenge Tyrell's words. Now, on a positive note, Tyrell said, his tone shifting slightly. I want to recognize someone who's shown what it means to have integrity and courage. He looked directly at Lisa, the black employee who had spoken up earlier. She stood at the edge of the group, her expression hesitant, as if she still wasn't sure whether she was being punished or praised. Lisa, Tyrell said, his voice warm but serious. You've shown what it means to stand up for what's right. Your actions today speak volumes. Because of your integrity, you will be promoted. You'll be taking on a new role in leadership. You've earned it. Lisa's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and gratitude flooding her face. She glanced around the room, unsure if she had heard correctly. The others stood still, watching her as she processed the news. Some seemed relieved, some confused, but none of them dared to question Tyrell's decision. Finally, Tyrell turned his gaze back to John, who stood a few paces behind the group. John's face was pale, his hands visibly shaking. He had been a silent observer through much of the conversation, but now his eyes met Tyrell's. I hope you understand the gravity of what's happening here, Tyrell said quietly, but with authority. You have a chance to turn this store around, John, but you need to make sure it happens. This is on you now. You'll do what's necessary. John nodded silently, the weight of Tyrell's words sinking in. His expression was no longer indifferent. He knew his job was on the line, and that things had to change or there would be consequences. Tyrell took a final sweeping look at the group. I expect results, not excuses. He turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his steps resolute. As the employees stood there, the silence lingered in the air, but something else had shifted too. Change had arrived, and it was coming whether they were ready or not. Tyrell stood at the center of the room, his presence commanding and calm. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The employees were no longer just standing there, they were taking in everything he had said. The weight of his words, combined with the actions that would follow, would define the store's future, and they knew it. He turned back to Lisa, who was still processing the unexpected promotion. Her face was a mixture of pride and disbelief, and for a moment she simply stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Tyrell smiled and reached out, extending his hand. Lisa hesitated for a brief moment before she shook it, her grip firm despite the lingering shock. This is the kind of leadership I want in my stores, Tyrell said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. Integrity, courage, and the strength to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. You've shown that today, and it's exactly what I need from those who represent my company. Lisa's eyes lit up with an emotion that Tyrell couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was gratitude. Or maybe it was the sense of validation she had long been seeking. She nodded, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She wasn't just being recognized, she was being elevated to a level she had long deserved. Turning his attention to the rest of the employees, Tyrell's gaze swept across the room one final time. There was a noticeable shift. The reluctance, the indifference, the discomfort, it was still there, but it had been replaced with something else. Awareness. They were all aware of the monumental change that had just unfolded, and they knew this store would never be the same again. I hope this isn't just a momentary lesson, Tyrell added, his voice firm and unwavering. This is only the beginning. This store and this company will operate with a new set of values moving forward, and those who don't align with those values, they won't have a place here. This is bigger than any one person. It's about the culture we create together. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was purposeful. The employees, though still processing, were absorbing what was happening. They had been handed a chance to redefine the environment in which they worked. The rules had changed, and they would either adapt or be left behind. Tyrell gave one final look to John, whose face was still pale, his hands trembling slightly. But there was something else there now, a realization, a recognition that the situation was far more serious than he had initially grasped. His initial defensiveness had dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. Tyrell didn't say anything more to John. The manager didn't need further explanation. His silence spoke volumes, and John knew that. With one last sweeping glance, Tyrell turned and walked toward the exit. He felt the cool air hit him as he stepped outside, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders. He wasn't filled with rage or frustration. He didn't even feel satisfaction. What he felt was certainty. Change had already taken root. It wasn't some distant future goal. It was now. It had started in that store, but it would spread to every corner of his company, every customer interaction, every policy and practice. Tyrell knew this was just the beginning, and that sense of purpose was far more powerful than any emotion. As he walked away, the confidence in his stride was unmistakable. He wasn't just a man with a vision anymore, he was a man with a mission, and that mission would ripple out, transforming not just this store, but the entire landscape of his business. Change wasn't coming. It was already here.